I'm Christoph von Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience Podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for.
I'm really excited to have David O'Neill today as a guest for the API Resilience Podcast. David O'Neill works at APIContext. We started talking at API Days New York about APIs as products versus APIs as utilities and like where the whole industry is moving. A lot of the things that I had been getting mixed signals from the community on from when I was publishing a post about APIs are utilities, not products, that resonated with you, as I remember, right, David?
That's correct, and I think I've been speaking to people about this last year as well, and possibly making myself unpopular on LinkedIn. That I think API monetization is a topic that's been around forever. John Musser used to give a talk on it maybe 10 years ago about ways to monetize your APIs, but I started asking the awkward question: do you really need to or want to monetize your APIs? It just doesn't make sense to monetize APIs sometimes. Not everything is about making money from the API in the same way that monetizing news information necessarily is what you're selling. Find other ways of monetizing it, not the fact that somebody can access your newsfeed via an API. That's not the bit where you should be making your money. Your value should lie somewhere else. It's driven a lot of companies who are not technology companies and don't have the wherewithal or in fact the desire to make money off their technology into technology companies trying to monetize technology, when actually they should focus on their core business and making money off their core business. And I think there's definitely been a trend of trying to make money off things that are not in your skill set.
And it's become a little bit of a red herring because of that. It's like people like tell management like, hey, we're going to make, or there's this new thing, like there's developers and apparently they have money. You know, if we just only like wrap our stuff into APIs, we're going to be able to sell them APIs. I'm going to make tons of money. Like, please invest here. Thank you.
And I think that's been what's gone wrong with a lot of the SaaS businesses. And I was actually having an argument with somebody yesterday about weather information. And they were pro a plan by the Republicans in America to close the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, NOAA. And they're saying, but you can buy weather data from lots of sources, and it should be just a SaaS sale that people buy the weather data from commercial companies, not from the government. And I was like, well, where do you think the weather companies get the data from in America that they are reselling? They get it from NOAA. And it's people don't understand the disambiguation of data sources and technology. And they just assume that, everything can become a commercial relationship. I just monetize it. It's like, well, some things can't easily be monetized. I think that's it has echoes with historical cycles we seem to go through. I think the UK has demonstrated this with the privatization of public utilities, particularly the water space. I think water and APIs actually have a lot of weird use as analogies for each other. That if you, the product is clean water. It's not the infrastructure. It's not the source. It's not the pipes. It's delivering clean water to people's houses. But everybody tends to forget that, and you privatize it. Everybody takes dividends, and you're still delivering water. And then you find out that if you don't keep up the infrastructure for the water, lots of bad things happen. But you've not noticed that that's not your core business, or it's not noticed that that's also part of your core business, but you've forgotten how to do it, and then you have sewage everywhere. And I think that's what we're seeing with cycles inside the tech industry. We saw it with .coms, where people would set up Amazon aside, who arguably, if they just stuck with being a shopping service, would have not been as successful as they becoming a cloud. They realized that they were actually a cloud compute technology vendor very quickly, and I think people forget that. Amazon started actually reselling their store services way earlier than the creation of AWS. And I think that people don't everyone thinks about Amazon as, we buy things from there. But they've been a software vendor for almost all of their history. It's only, it's just because it's only recent AWS came around. And I think a lot of people should look at what happened to sort of things like pets.com and some of the delivery services and other things where people forgot that they don't have shops, they don't have food, they don't have infrastructure, and all they're doing is delivering somebody else's stuff. And we're seeing it here in the US post the pandemic, where it's clear that a lot of the delivery services and the shopping cart services and the other things where they send out somebody to pick stuff up had just ignored how much it actually costs to run a service.
Yeah.
And basically are now pricing themselves out of operations because they've been subsidized by VC money for so long that they didn't actually think about how much it really costs to send somebody to do your shopping for you. And people were a bit shocked to find, well, actually, it costs me an extra $50 a time to send someone to do my shopping for me, to which I kind of say, well, yes, because you're not doing it. And that will, how much do you get paid? What is your hourly rate? Same with delivery services. And the bit that interests me with delivery services, much like APIs, is lots of businesses were able to run delivery services before Uber Eats and DoorDash and Grubhub and others tried to turn it into a business. Delivery of pizza has been a thing for a long time, and companies that made pizzas had ways of delivering pizzas. And the interesting thing is, I can still get pizza delivered to me by pizza places that have their own pizza delivery services, who don't use any of those services and never got caught up in it. But just adding an API on top of a FedEx service or a UPS service and trying to disarticulate that and then make money on the margins by being a service that crosses over into other delivery services via API isn't necessarily a business, because you're trying to introduce a middleman where you don't need one, because at the end of the day, it's possible to just go and do it direct. And I think a lot of people got confused by what APIs are for. And I think they're about how you deliver your business, how you reduce friction between you and your customers. And a lot of people decided, it's how I can build a business to deliver more APIs, because APIs are technical and hard. And therefore, those big, slow dinosaurs will never figure it out. Well, actually, they're not that hard. And big dinosaurs eventually in the tech space will work out how to do it, because it isn't difficult. And then you have a business problem. And I think we're seeing that come to fruition now, with a lot of organizations realizing, well, hang on, how do we scale our business? Because there is nowhere for our business to go.
So this is like the big aggregator squeeze, or the API aggregator squeeze that you're seeing happening.
I think I will preface this by saying I think there are some unique regional reasons why some of the aggregators who have been around for a long time historically continue to exist.
Yeah.
But I think people who appeared in the last 10 to 15 years to essentially become a service aggregator off the back of zero interest rates and free money and lots of VC cash, they are going to struggle, because essentially they are having to add cost on top of a one-to-one relationship. And at the end of the day, people will go, the convenience will not be worth the cost of having the aggregator in place. I think if we look at the US market and then switch into, say, financial services, there are a lot of very big aggregators who grew up in the days of screen scraping, who have built API platforms. But the reason they exist is, in the US, unlike the European Union or the UK, where there are central certificating authorities that allow you to have a one-to-many relationship with all the banks. In the US, you have to have a one-to-one relationship with every bank you want to integrate to. And that puts an enormous legal and operational overhead on any company trying to break into that sector. So, and ironically, the US looks at that as being pro-business and pro-competition. Because anybody can go and have, you don't have to prove to the government that you're a safe pair of hands for an API key. But you do have to go and prove to 150 banks you are, which is not as easy as proving to one agency. But those aggregators, then they've always been in the mix, because they've already negotiated those bilateral relations, and then you just have to negotiate with them. And I think that's why organizations like Stripe, like Plaid, like MX, like Trustly, Tink in Europe, they kind of have a place because they've done some of the commercial stuff. But I think it's less important in Europe, where you have the IDA certificates and you have ways of anybody saying, well, I'm going to follow the rules. I will sign up, I'll get the IDA certificate, and then I'll be able to be passported into all the banks in the European Union.
I think it's kind of like if developer experience is your only differentiator, you're in trouble. That's basically.
Yes, I think the bit that we all know and nobody wants to talk about, but I think it's hurting some very large developer tool companies, is developers don't pay for anything.
Yeah.
And unless you're solving a business problem for somebody in the company who has budget, you won't make very much money as a developer tool. Yeah. And there are some companies out there which are worth, on paper, billions at the moment, who have a lot of challenges with increasing the value of their sales, because developers use them for convenience, but it's not. Management doesn't care, and I think that's the fundamental problem. It's not making the business money. That you've got a really useful test tool that's very good at testing APIs. Yeah. Because management isn't. That's a cost of doing business as far as management is concerned. It's not running their business for them. Whereas you go and look at their API gateway, which is now essential for delivering business, and the API gateways can go and say, API gateway aimed at developers can go and make a lot more money. But I think the tooling space is squeezed unless you're offering something that is making a problem go away for the business. And we can see in our space at APIContext that conformance and governance is becoming more important than performance. Performance is useful from an operational perspective, but the business is: am I going to get fined? Have we done something bad? Are we going to end up with a phone call from a regulator or the European Commission asking what we've done? And we need to protect ourselves from that. There's different classes of tooling that are going to make a huge difference to what the industry looks like in 5 years. And I think we've had, to echo a point I know you've made before, Christoph, we're moving from, hey, APIs are cool, they're going to make it easier to build and maintain software, to we use APIs for absolutely everything and the business is APIs, to no, our business is still financial services or making mobile phone calls or sending text messages or whatever, and APIs are just part of how we deliver that. And my business still needs to deliver these things, and it's going to be tracked on this set of rules rather than the fact that we've got APIs. I think we went through a bit of a 5-6 year detour where everybody thought that they were in the business of APIs and lost sight of whatever their business was.
And maybe this is a good point to do a little segue and to explain a little bit about your company, because we jumped straight into the deep end.
We did. I like doing that though. So,
yeah. But it was good. Yeah.
So APIContext, which grew out of the merger of APImetrics and Context last year, is simply put, we started life to answer a question that I and my co-founder had of, were the APIs we were integrating to working back in when we were working in the telecom sector. And we were finding it very hard to get APIs working, and we couldn't figure out why. And it turned out the APIs were not as reliable as the provider thought they were. And it turned out that's still a problem that we see, that APIs are very good at failing in clever ways that make it look like they're working. And sometimes you won't see it on the back end. Other times it will only be visible to somebody from the outside in. And what we wanted to be able to do was test and exercise APIs from the outside, from the clouds where you build applications, and see how they worked. And what we found was, if you're not paying attention to what the world looks like, if you're a Google shop or if you're calling from Azure, you will end up with a very different view to somebody who thinks the world looks like AWS. Mm-hmm. And if you think the world looks like AWS, that might be good. A lot of people use AWS, but if your customer uses Azure, for example, or you use Azure and your customers don't, the world will look very different to them, and there will be latency that you aren't experiencing, and there will be other problems. And we find that there have been some very practical bits missed by false assumptions that engineering groups have made. So our thesis was, let's give people a very simple way of exercising APIs from the outside in. Let's do it in such a way as it's not going to scare corporate security. And it's very easy to break your API security by writing JavaScript and doing all sorts of things. But as soon as you get into financial services, where you're likely to have MTLS for the connection, and you'll have a JOT signed by a certificate issued by a signing authority, you have to be very careful how you handle that, particularly in Europe with an EIDA certificate, because that's potentially the keys to your kingdom financially. So we've built an infrastructure that allowed you to test and manage API calls exactly the same way that third parties would, with all the same security. and see how they work from different locations. And the final piece we've added now is that conformance piece I mentioned, which is, are you, everyone lints before they go into production. Everyone tests and lints their API specification and validates things. But the reality is nobody does that every single build, not in an agile world. They do it every major release or every few months or even every year. And things break and things shift. And that can break your solutions. It can cause problems for people. And in the case of financial services, it can even start to cause fines where you drift away from a specification without realizing it. And what our platform does is give the business, product managers, and engineering a way to validate that everything is conformant and compliant and performant in production where it matters. And it's proving very powerful in financial services, but we have customers in IT, general IT, in telco, and it's trying to deal with that business, that intersection of business and DevOps, which nobody wants to talk about, but everybody has to at some point accept exists.
And I think with that, you're also kind of a front runner of this shift from APIs as a product for developers to APIs that are becoming a utility. Because when APIs become so essential and such a fundamental aspect of anything you do in your business, when from being the thing that you're selling, they become the thing that enables everything, their continuity and their predictability become like a really essential thing. So I think with that, your business really is at the front, at the front edge of that.
And I think the other piece is shifting that as far right as possible into the production world. I understand why there's a lot of resistance to monitoring in production, particularly in services where you are dealing with real people's data or potentially real people's data and real accounts. But the fact is, if you're not monitoring in production, you're not monitoring. You cannot rely on, and we're seeing this, and I think it's been a mind shift in the last 2 or 3 years from, our APM does everything and we just look at the logs, to if we're just looking at the APM and the logs, we don't actually have any idea minute to minute how our business is running. And we've heard this from a customer who, they're a regional bank in Europe. They were finding that by just using APM logs, they were losing 3 to 4 hours in resolution time when something went wrong, because at 3:45 a.m., there's no load on the system, no one's using it, and errors were being ignored if there were any. And then suddenly everybody wakes up at 6:30, 7 o'clock, starts commuting to work, and then the errors start crashing in when they could have fixed it 3 or 4 hours before if they'd known it had gone wrong. And they've been very aggressive at having a heartbeat on everything that a customer could interact with before that risk of, oh no, all the customers are bad. The other thing I think people forget, which we're seeing particularly in the US, is there's a lot of third-party money transfer services because the US doesn't have anything like central clearing. So there's no BACS transfer systems. And if those third-party systems go down or have a bad day, no one blames them. They blame the bank because they're looking at their bank app and they don't notice that they're actually transferring it through the third party. They're just using a bank app. And if it's not going through, they're on the phone to the bank support team. I think these are the things where people are realizing, hang on, we have to look at our supply chain, our service mesh of all the things that we rely on APIs for, and actually validate they're all working, and do that consistently rather than waiting until we get lots of errors and then trying to work out where they're coming from. And I think that approach is still changing. That people are only just starting to realize they have to use synthetics. They have to actually validate what's coming back. It's not enough to just look at HTTP codes. I know I've always had a sort of frenemy relationship with John Sheehan of RunScope as well, because we founded the companies at roughly the same time. And his strapline was 200 all okay. But one of the problems is 200 is not all okay. And it's one of those things in developer mindset is, oh, I got a 200 code, it's great. Yeah. And then ignoring that actually what follows is an error.
Yeah.
And no one noticed it was it's 200, but the result says service down, or it's a GraphQL API and it always returns 200, but then you end up with a wrapped body. You work in the telco sector. You get returned a 200 OK and some JSON, but inside the JSON is an XML string wrapped in curly brackets. And you have to then crawl through the XML and parse it and go, oh, okay, well, that's a SOAP error from some back-end system that everyone's pretending is actually returning a REST JSON API.
Yeah. And so when we were talking, one thing that's, you had a lot of really interesting stories about like the complexity of and the regional differences in the banking sector and how all of this is affecting things. And like I think maybe also looking at the potential for more standardization for people actually working together. Can you tell me like a couple of stories about like interacting with the German banking sector? What are you seeing happening there? How is that different from the US? How is that different from the UK? Yeah,
I'll leave Germany because we're not interacting that well with Germany, but the US, UK, Europe are all very interesting different markets, and Canada will likely be a different one as well. So we started doing open banking about 5 years ago with UK banks, and the UK took a very forward-looking view on this, which is the banks needed to compete. The banks needed to provide, firstly, open data, so they need to provide information on their products and anything that a third party might need to decide quickly whether to go with Bank A or Bank B or Bank C. The second thing, which is I think emerging as a right across the EU, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, is your data is your data. And it doesn't matter whether it's his financial transaction record or your utility bills. That's your data, and you should have a right. You have a right to access it. And obviously, the sensible thing is to make that available via API. So the UK set up a way of essentially passporting providers into accessing bank data, and all the banks had to provide a common set of interfaces for that. That's been very powerful, and it's led to some very novel financial solutions, particularly in things like credit checking, because the credit system where you just come up with a credit score number and then loan money is a little bit, I don't know, arcane or weird. Nobody really knows what the rules are. But new types of lenders may say, well, we'll look at your financial track record and we'll assess you based on the last 12 months and then decide. The UK therefore open up their entire banking sector, and there are about 40 banks in the UK. They all have common access control. So once you've got the certificates to access one, as long as there's a bank account, you can sign into any of them. And that's been very interesting from the point of view of performance and how well people have worked. And we've seen new banks emerge and some fail, but the new banks have all, because they've built from scratch on new infrastructure, have done very well. We then see the next cohort, which are the biggest 5 or 6 banks in the UK. They are doing okay, but they clearly have a huge technical debt and a lot of infrastructure that they have to just beat into submission, but they're very big and have a lot of staff to do it. And then there's the next cohort, which are the small regional banks, who I think are really suffering because they don't have the big infrastructure, they don't have the large teams, and they are having to compete with companies that can pay better than they can and have access to better technologies, but everyone has to offer a common infrastructure, and I think that's been very challenging for a lot of these institutions. So the UK, but what it's meant has the UK has been able to come up with some very interesting financial services and financial technologies in the view of being able to make it compete better. But one thing you start to see is nobody actually wants to have 15 different pay options in their app. So I'm starting to see that in the US, where I bought cinema tickets a couple of hours ago to Deadpool and Wolverine, but there were 7 payment options on the app for Venmo, PayPal, Apple Pay, standard credit card interface, and so on and so forth. And it's like there's almost like decision fatigue. Which one do I use? And it boils down to which one is going to give me which one am I going to have to do the least to set up? And then, so if we look at the US, then historically the US has a ridiculous, I think it's 8,000 or 9,000 banking institutions in the US, ranging from institutions like Redneck Bank in Alabama, which I think services about 3 towns and is a tiny bank, through to JP Morgan Chase, which is a global behemoth with trillions of dollars of assets. And they don't have to offer any services to anybody, but they know they have to for competition basis. And the US government's now saying, well, actually, you should, for the same consumer data rights reasons, give people access to their financial transactions, to their credit card statements, to their banking statements. And that has always worked by bilateral relationships. So if you want to access JP Chase Morgan or Redneck Bank or whomever, you have to go to them and say, I'm building a financial services app. I would like to have a relationship with you. And then go through that one-on-one negotiation with each bank. So that's led to the rise of very big aggregators. So Trustly, Plaid, MX, Experian, Finicity, who are part of MasterCard now, all grew up with this being that conduit to solve that problem where you have to negotiate with dozens or even hundreds of institutions, and they take away that pain. So you pick your aggregator and you let the aggregator have the pain. So that historically, that means the aggregators have solved the problem of interoperability. But even the aggregators are starting to find that's painful. So they've also jumped on the financial data exchange bandwagon and said, yes, we must have some standardization because we can't keep changing our APIs for every provider. And that's a different model. Canada's doing another one, which will probably ultimately look more like the UK. Australia looks more like the UK, but somehow worse, that they've made it virtually impossible for anybody to work with each other. And no one in the Australian government's an interesting creature, and no one's actually wanted to enforce any of the rules. Whereas in the UK, they've issued fines for non-compliance, and they aren't very big, but they're sort of, this fine will be £50,000. The next fine will have another zero on it, and we'll keep making the fines bigger until you get the message. And then in Europe, we have PSD3, we had PSD, we had PSD2, which forgot to mention APIs. We have PSD3, which mentions APIs but doesn't specify the APIs. And I think ultimately the European Union or the European Commission will have to have a pan-European API standard for data interchange and data sharing, just to make sure that a bank in Greece can know it can trade and interoperate with a bank in France or a bank in Holland or Belgium. And I think that's still missing in PSD3, but they are specifying availability criteria, and they are saying how well things should work, and they are saying that there must be ways of the bank sharing data, but they've just stopped slightly short of where I was hoping they would go with PSD3. Yeah. And it leaves it with the regional governments to decide what they want to do. And it kind of amuses me because of the UK and Brexit, as you can tell from my accent. That's where I'm originally from. And it's the kind of thing where they were saying, well, we can't be governed by Europe because they keep coming up with these terrible rules. And actually in this instance, the UK has rules far beyond anything that the European Union has considered acceptable. But I think it's the direction of travel for the EU, and we're seeing evidence in France, in the Nordic countries, and others that yes, they want to have standardization of APIs, and it's going everything over the next 10 years. There will be standardized ways for large banks and all banks to interchange data around personal information, around financial data, around transactions, to make it easier for them to build apps and have them work globally without having to rewrite their technology every time they move to a different geography. And I think if you see the moves by someone like Apple, where they're moving into open banking, and I think it will be driven by companies like Apple saying, well, we if you want to be on the iPhone, then you'll start following the standard, because we're not going to build a custom interface for the banks in Denmark just because Denmark's refusing to go along with the standard that everybody else is. Yeah. And I think that will drive the next wave of adoption of these things, but it will also add a whole new compliance and governance piece on top of that, because people want to say, well, hang on, are we compliant? Am I missing something?
But so there's this really interesting interplay happening right now, where on the one hand, there's this market push or the just economical push for more standardization, but then at the same time, there's also a push for more sovereignty, like data sovereignty. So it's this weird thing. Like on one hand, the API scene is maturing into more standardized API designs, so because it just makes more sense. But at the same time, there's this deglobalization happening, I don't know. I've seen some. I've heard some people talk about this, that 10 years ago, we were all going for global supply chains and everything was just becoming one thing. And now actually we started splitting stuff up again, and you can't you can't always rely that if you have an organization that crosses boundaries, that you'll be able to actually make your supply chains work and stuff like that.
Well, I think that's going to lead to some interesting compliance and risk requirements and some adaptations of technology. I'm going to use APIContext. We can do this. Yeah. And we've really seen this with things like data sovereignty and data transfers. So if you make a call to your preferred Office suite of applications from the data center where you host your app, your suite, do the calls always stay within the European Union, or do they end up in, I don't know, picking randomly, Japan? Because the internal load balancing system inside the provider has routed to the next available unit, and that just happened to be in another region entirely. And I think it's not a huge percentage of calls, but we're talking about non-zero, sometimes 1 or 2% of calls end up outside of region, simply because for a global company they have to load balance, and sometimes the routing tables are congested, or that rather than fail a call or give have somebody's Office application throw an error, it will get you the data, even if it has to go and get it from a shard somewhere else. And that is going to, I think people will want to know, well, how big is that problem? And, is it happening with things that it shouldn't do? And I think people will want to monitor for that risk and understand what the scale of it is before they actually do get hit with a fine by an ICO in a country.
Yeah, so it's a weird world. It's like, on one hand, people are still challenging the notion that the standardization is happening and it's going to come along, even if we don't want it. There's just too much market incentives to fully prevent it from happening. And potentially AI might actually, or LLMs or AI in more general, might actually accelerate some of this standardization efforts, or make it maybe not even necessary because some of the mapping can be done automatically. But then at the same time, there's this shifts happening, the geopolitical shifts between the different regions. Very interesting times.
Very interesting times, and I think to bring that to bring it back to where we started, I think it means that a lot of the providers whom I think there will continue to be consolidation around some of the actual vendor systems and some of the infrastructure systems. But I think mostly it will be. I think it's noticeable that we haven't seen many of the companies that provide the core systems disappear. It's been companies who grew up in the last 5 years to try and compete with incumbents. And it turned out that in a lot of these sectors, there's a reason why the incumbents are there, that it's actually quite hard to, just because you have a cooler product that might be slightly easier to use, you're making a lot of assumptions about that being the only reason why people don't change things. I think there's probably lots of case studies on this. There's a concept in economics about the elasticity of demand, that some products, the price changes a lot with demand and supply, whereas other things don't change at all. No matter how hard it is to get, the price kind of stays the same. And I think there's a lot of that concept plays a lot with things like banking, that the opportunity cost of changing all of your banking over from one bank to another is extremely high. And even with open banking, it's actually quite hard to move all of your auto payments and everything. I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of my bank that I bank with, which I will not mention, but the thought of moving to another bank and then having to change everything over just is like, I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to bother. So I think I think that happens a lot with technology, that people think, oh, these dinosaurs, these large companies, they don't do a good product for people, and we'll create a better one using APIs, and we'll have a better app. And they've got confused between the better experience, the core product, and the APIs. And I think, to go back to where we started, the APIs are only ever a way of selling your product. They're not the way you sell your product.
Yeah,
you still need to have a product people will buy, and you have to monetize based on what people are buying, not on the way that you deliver it.
And it's there are some exceptions. Like, I could imagine like a trust product that banks can build based on, is this person, is this actually a real person, because they have to do a lot of verification. Like it's similar with the telco sector. There are some edge cases where I think they can have a product that is like a new product that they currently don't offer, but like an extension of their current business. But it's probably going to be completely dwarfed by the rest of their business, and making sure that they're not just seeing APIs as a play on this new potential market of developers that are going to buy stuff from them, but to see it as a distribution channel and a platform for accelerating both internal work, and then also as a platform for building out ecosystems and enabling, like that new layer of experience that we're building right now. I think that's really important.
I think they could, and we've seen we've been doing some work on this around identity and monitoring identity services. And I think we're certainly seeing this in some jurisdictions around age verification and trying to move away from ID cards to something that will do your age verification on your phone, often with your bank or banking provider, because they know who you are and they can provide. But then I think that starts to put too much of a onus on these things. Yeah. That you stop being you and your phone becomes you. I had an incident 2 years ago in Spain where I dropped my phone in the floor of a cab, and I was effectively locked. I got my phone back. The hotel were able to get a hold of the car, and they got it back to me. But I couldn't authenticate into any apps. I couldn't do anything to prove who I was without my phone. So now I carry two phones, both with authenticator apps on them, and both with access to my password thing. But it's always in my mind be the weak spot of this sort of multi-factor auth world, where if something happens to your device, you are in real trouble. I had another incident last year at an API conference where I dropped my phone and I realized the screen was going black, and I had probably 20 minutes to get to a phone shop to replace it before I lost the screen. And it was touch and go, because they had to do a multi-factor auth with me in the phone store. Even though I was in a phone store for my carrier with my ID, they still had to do a text-based push to my phone. And we could barely read it, but we managed to get through that. And I think there are a lot of systems that we are building which will change that trust dynamic. And I think that one of those is going to fail, and it's going to be a very bad day for everybody involved. Yeah. And I think there are new products we might need to come up with, which should be driven by APIs. But I think there is definitely a risk of becoming the phone becoming the wrong conduit. And I think we have already gone into that as I think people are starting to see that MFA is not necessarily the be all and end all.
One story I started developing, I think a couple of weeks ago, although that it might be older, but I had a conversation that triggered this concept, is that like today we are in the web of publishing, which is where we are publishing how you can get access to something. And then you have to go and consume that documentation to be able to actually execute it. So it's like, and that can be like marketing documentation on some corporate websites that explains what products they have and how to get access to a product, how to get support and whatever. We're evolving from this web of publishing to the web of interacting, where potentially we'll have soon-ish, who knows, AI agents or agents, like just drop the buzzword, but that can act on our behalf. So first of all, there's lots of ways that this can go wrong, but like what you just described, like if your device, if that is your mobile phone, the good thing is that it's you can have privacy. The bad thing is that if it's a single point of failure, how do you see this?
It's an interesting topic. One of the reasons the UK decided not to go with identity cards a few years ago was there's a realistic risk with identity cards that the identity card becomes you. The US has a variation on that with both driving licenses and your social security number. The social security number is, to all intents and purposes, you. If someone has it, they can do all sorts of things without having to prove much more. So that type of reliance on single sources of identification or verification I think it's going to become a bigger problem for us. The world of AI is interesting. We've been doing some benchmarking and monitoring of AI APIs, and we found there is a roughly 2 to 5%, sometimes it's as high as 10, but varying on the use case, instance of just wrong results. People call them hallucinations, but they're just statistical. It's statistical errors. The way LLMs work is it's a statistical guess of what the next word should be in the chain, and it's very good and it's very clever, but it will make mistakes. It will make mistakes because data sources get confused, or somebody has been out there deliberately shit posting on Reddit and creating whole strings of things that are wrong. And I think we will be in for a reckoning, and we're already seeing this when the AI agents start to train themselves on their own output. You end up in a bad failing cascade loop. And I think we'll get around that, but I think it won't be as quick as people think. And I think that I strongly suspect a lot of money will be wasted on this. They're very powerful tools. If you let them loose on your business and get rid of humans now, you're going to have a very, very bad business day in the next year or two, or even probably sooner than that. And I think for us, it grows into some new conformance opportunities for us, because one of the things we've realized people don't have is a source of truth inside their business. That they do have a source of truth. It's often not centralized in a place where you can point to and say that file there is our truth on our interest rates, on the names of our SKUs, on the names of our products. They will have that in different systems. It might be in an ERP system. It might be in their CRM. It could be in an ERP, a CRM, a database for the WordPress site that they run for their marketing, and a spreadsheet that's actually the master file that's kept on Sally's kept in Sally's folder. And Sally is the person who keeps up to date, except Sally just retired. And nobody realized that that's where all the truth is. And we've been surprised talking to customers about this compliance risk thing of they don't have a source of truth for a lot of their fundamental business data. The source of truth is distributed across the organization. So all they want to do is to be able to say, this thing here, the website, the thing we say in public is our source of truth. It has to be, because if anyone complains and that's what's public, we have to honor it. So we have to validate that everything else we output, which will be via our APIs, matches that. And we at APIContext have built some technology now to do that automatically for customers. So scrape the source of truth, build the conformance files, and then monitor them. And that's something we're launching. And we're seeing a lot of interest from companies who we have to know what we are claiming we do and whether it's correct or not. It's very similar to, I think the law behind it is very similar in most countries now, particularly across the developed world, which is if a price is given in a shop or on a website, you kind of have to honor the price, even if the price is wrong.
Yeah.
And it's very important not to have prices that are wrong, but it's quite hard to actually do that validation check. And I think we're going to see in the next 6 to 12 months that becoming even more important for people, because if somebody sues you because you said, well, this we'll offer a loan at 3%, and so we're not offering loans at 3% anymore, the loans are at 5%. It's, well, it's on your website, or your app said 3%, and it's like, that's what I'm going to lock into. And it's like, well, that what do we do? And there will be nothing they can do. So I think that bit is going to require a whole mindset change in performance. And I think AI will make it harder to do.
But is the source of truth? So for me, I see AI as like fancy grease around APIs. I think that the real value is in the APIs and the processes that are encoded in the APIs. And then the AI just makes it easier for mere humans to interact with that stuff. But what was interesting, what you're saying was that the website is seen as the source, or at least the publicly accountable source. It's
the publicly accountable source, because that's where, in the same way that if you're in a Lidl or a Aldi or whatever, what have you, and you see you pick up a packet of cereal and it says $2.99, you expect to pay $2.99. And if it's $5.99 at the checkout, you can say, well, it's $2.99 on the shelf, and they'll go and check and they'll sell it to you for what it says on the shelf, because there's a lot of case law for that the thing you state is the truth. And most people and most case law at the moment supports the website being that. And I think there's the problem is it's got very complicated keeping that stuff up to date. And while as technologists, we might think, well, the obvious thing would be to have a centralized database with that store of data. As a technologist, you can also think, well, that's never going to work in a large company because they don't have one database. They've got 47. And they all do slightly different things, and they don't have common interfaces anyway. So, because one of them was originally installed in 1973.
Yeah. So, but it's an interesting question because, and I've seen this. This was also how I was at a banking conference a couple of months ago, and then one of the presentations was about the shift from API as one of the silos, like so one of the business silos, to APIs as the platform layer on top of which you layer all the other stuff. So that's when you build a mobile app, or when you build a website, or when you build a support channel, like all of it is fed by a layer of APIs that are common across the organization. So kind of like, well, it's the middleware, kind of this layer in between. Do you see this already happening, or it still is a lot of duct tape and glue?
I think it's a lot of duct tape and glue. What you describe is what it should be.
Yeah.
But fortunes have been entire careers have been spent trying to do what you've described. I have a good friend who the last software he worked on, which was to decommission, was the same piece of software that he helped set up when he graduated. And he had a nearly 30-year career in IT, and it was he was decommissioning. This is quite recently a COBOL Kix DB2 database.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of very old legacy things out there that don't talk very well to newer things, but they work. And every attempt to shift them over ends up costing far more money than everybody thought. So, and I think we see this in transportation, payment systems. We see this in healthcare. We still see it in banking. Some of the which I think we've talked about in the UK, we have the legacy banks, the old building societies, the smaller regional banks. We have them everywhere. Their IT infrastructure is ancient in some cases, and then you have the in the UK the CMA9, the 9 largest banks in the country. And they are amalgams of banks going back sometimes centuries. But we know for a fact in one of our customers, they've got databases that go back to the late 1960s that are still holding a portion of accounts, because there's never been a mechanism to really transfer that data off some of those things, because that's just the nature of IT. When British Airways had their their messaging infrastructure shut down and basically took out their seat allocation system. This is, I guess, 5-6 years ago.
Yeah.
It was the APIs that failed, but the problem was the back end that failed was nearly 50 years old.
Yeah.
And they just layered bits of software on to turn it into a more modern interface. But at the core was something that was invented around the time the concept of the API was first invented, which was 1968. So I think what you describe is what it should be, but I think we could be still 15, 20 years off that. I think everybody assumes that technology moves at this lightning fast pace, and it's always at the cutting edge. And actually a lot of things are computerized versions of the paper they used to push around, running on things that were thrown together a long time ago and have just been there forever and no one wants to touch. And there isn't the cost, there isn't the budget to fix some of these things, because as soon as particularly you get into some of these big banking or big government projects, you're talking phone numbers as budgets. It's literally 10-digit numbers for redoing a medium-sized, large country's healthcare records in system. And that money we've seen, there was a case in the UK where I think something like £100 billion was spent on medical records to make it possible to access them via APIs in each hospital. And the system never worked properly. Yeah. And that's I think the reality is any CIO or particularly CIOs out there, they have to accept that from a risk and compliance thing, that they're going to have this technical debt and data debt for a very long time that could become critical at any day. And they need to have systems in place that keep track of their risk. And I think it just becomes, APIs aren't doing anything new. They're just making it easier to do newer things. But the risks don't go away just because you have an API.
Another story I've been telling is that CIO from Chief Information Officer is going to become Chief Interface Officer, and that's the focus of like just thinking about the information, the thing, instead of like looking at the thing itself. It's going to become about the constraints that you put around the thing, and the boundaries that you're managing and guarding and like hardening. But I like it touches on a question about where do the constraints live? Do you is it sufficient to put your constraints at the edge of the system and then just manage that, or do like? I think the answer is that you have to go inside, because otherwise you're going to have security issues. But
yes, but I think that there's a meta problem above that, which is not meta Facebook, but just meta physical. The data sources you rely on might not be your own. We were talking when we were setting this up. One of our banking customers, one of their primary ways that their customers transfer money is not a system they own; it's a third party. But nobody thinks about it being a third party. So if it doesn't work, they don't blame the third party; they blame the customer. And I think this also becomes a brand protection issue for a lot of companies. I've been predicting this for over nearly a decade now, but we're now starting to see it happen. Which is if AWS East 1 goes down, nobody really groks at a fundamental level that AWS East 1 is why every website on planet Earth has gone down. Yeah. It is because they're just going, well, I can't sign into my thing, so I'll blame the app. The app you can't sign into is not able to sign you in because Okta is down, because Okta is on AWS East 1. Actually, they're multi-region now, so they're probably protected. But there's these chains of reliability that I think, even to this day, a lot of CIOs do not understand for their own businesses, that if X happens, what happens to all of our dependent services? And they're not doing audits of those dependent services, and they're not really monitoring those dependent services in the way that they ought to, because they kind of assume that they're like a utility, they're there. But they are just IT systems, and they rely on other people's things, and there are these cascading chains. There's a very funny graphic of a complex set of boxes showing your typical IT architecture. At the very bottom, they're sort of overhanging, and at the very bottom there's a tiny little triangle, and it's got an arrow saying that AWS is East 1, and that's the world. You take away one of these pieces and things crash, and no one knows what that looks like. And I think that's where the risk comes. What are you promising to deliver? Do you know what you're promising to deliver? Do you know who is delivering it for you? And I think those three questions are questions we have a whole other podcast on. I think every CIO should be able to answer those. Yeah. But if you look at a modern enterprise, a modern large enterprise, you could be talking about 1,000 systems and 10,000 APIs that you are dependent on that are absolutely, totally out of your control.
Yeah. And then the only thing you can really do is to monitor the edges of those systems and to make sure that you're like, well, to build your resilience, you probably have to have a resilient network of those, and then you have to be monitoring what's actually passing through the edges of the system. Yeah,
and I think that is I think that's something people are starting to realize. But I genuinely thought people would start to realize this 5 years ago, when and maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where we had that massive AWS outage that took out probably a third of the internet for about 12 hours.
Yeah,
but no, we still see the same behaviors and the same patterns, because it's very hard. And with all I fully understand if you're a site reliability engineer or a DevOps manager, you don't, it's bad enough that you have to keep your plates spinning in your infrastructure. You don't want to be saying, well, hang on, now tell me about AWS, Stitch, and the Microsoft and Google and the DocuSign and these 37 other Salesforce and all of monitor all of these as well, and and let me know if they break. And it's like, I don't want to do that. That's a huge overhead. But I don't think people just can't keep. I don't think they just keep on passing that plate to someone else and hoping for the best. I think there's a real, at some point, the parcel, I mean, at some point the music stops and someone's left holding it. And that would be another bad day for everybody in the industry. And it's not an if, it genuinely is a when we have another systemic outage, a DNS system falls over, there's some other problem. But then, talking about legacy technical debt that nobody thinks about, DNS and DNS and IP addresses are still that lurking monster under the bed that is going to come out and eat everybody at some point. And we can talk about, we should switch to UDP and we should improve how the networking infrastructure works, but no one's doing it. Most of the clouds barely even realize that IPv6 exists now. Most of them are still on IPv4. And the routing tables are getting ever more complicated. They're getting ever more congested, and that adds huge latency. And at some point, one of them will go down and something will break. And then we'll have another day or two where getting it back up again will consume billions of dollars of resources of planet Earth, maybe trillions. And that's as we become more dependent on intelligent agents doing the work for us, which will be driven by API calls, which will be driven by internet traffic, which will be driven by data centers. It's going to happen. And I think everybody's just sort of sitting, looking at their piece of the puzzle, hoping that all of the other bits keep getting filled in and working, and that everybody is as diligent as they are. And I know I've got friends who work in infrastructure in some of the big names. And one of them moved from a company that he described was anally retentive about this problem and monitored everything, because if they went down, a lot of other people did. And he went to another essential part of the internet and found that they didn't care quite as deeply as he was used to. And there are things that keep him up at night with, well, if that happens, then all of these things will break, and I don't want, so he spends a lot of his time worrying about those things. It's going to happen, and people won't be able to access their bank accounts. They won't be able to sign into services. They won't be able to prove who they are. There will be it's not as bad as a malware attack, but it's more. I would say it's more dangerous because it's an own goal. It's not an outside actor trying to bring down the system. It's the system will come down by its own problems. And I don't think we spend enough time as an industry worrying about that bit. The challenge for those of us who've worked in the API sector for a long time now is that APIs have made the risk higher, but the benefits of have so far outweighed that risk. But I think we do as an industry need to take, coming back onto my pitch, you need to take monitoring more seriously. And I think a lot of people treat monitoring as I'll look at my server logs and I'll look at my gateway logs, and that's monitoring, and not, am I actually validating that all of the bits that keep my infrastructure working are working? And do I know who my DNS host is? Do I know what my 15 critical services are and whether they're working or not? Do I know if we deprecate an API, did we leave it running? Short answer is yes, you did. It's
most likely.
Yes, almost certainly, in fact. And we're now seeing that in UK Open Banking, because we're about to release a new numbered release of UK Open Banking. But there'll have to be a huge handover period, which is obviously good for us, because a lot of our customers will have to then monitor two sets of infrastructure. But it becomes an interesting question of, when you shut off, what do you do? And we see this with large companies all the time. They've got tens of thousands of APIs, but they're not sure. Even they haven't spent the money or the resources to monitor which ones are working or not. And we'll find these 15 endpoints are dead. Did you know that? No, but because people, once they say, well, that's no longer my problem, it stops being anybody's problem. And I think I did hear somebody saying we're reaching the point where API, I think it actually just is the CIO, but I like the idea of the chief interface officer, because they are the chief API officer. They're the chief systems officer. They are responsible for everything inbound and outbound in your organization that runs over bits and bytes. And I think
and it's a system, so it's like you cannot isolate your company from the rest of the world. It's one interconnected system. And that means that you are the only place where you can control what is happening with yourself is to have a good boundary, and to watch your interfaces that are crossing those boundaries. And but I was thinking, like, there's like, there's similar patterns in nature where like all of mammalian life has conserved interface systems for hormonal stuff and a bunch of other things. And even though that those APIs are preserved or are conserved, there's some viruses that take advantage of those things, but still the system is very resilient. So maybe there are some things that we can go and look at. How do biological systems deal with this, with interface security? And because it is very similar. They have a cell at its boundaries. There's transporters. There's certain receptors. It's very similar model. But it's definitely something we will need to pay attention to going forward as APIs become more important and they become kind of like the DNA of the digital world, of interacting world.
I like that one too. I'll write that one down. No, I think it's no. You're absolutely right, and I think we've had a detour over the last 5 years or so of APIs were like a gold rush. The gold rush then became kind of crypto, and then became AI.
Yeah,
and it's the shiny. I'll drop these buzzwords into a presentation. I had a lucky exit before, and therefore I'm going to get $100 million to build this company. And then the boring world of delivering what's already been built, it kind of falls back on companies like ours, which have grown up more or less the old-fashioned way, and do provide a solution which solves a business problem for people. And it's not as glamorous or as exciting, but it is, we're still here after 10 years, sort of thing. Yeah. And I think you can't stop people looking for that shiny thing, looking for that exciting new thing, but everything builds on everything else. And the people who will succeed are the people who think, well, we've got legacy software that's not going away. We've got legacy systems. And I remember when I was very, very early in my career as an actual physical engineer on metal things. I did process and plant and processes. And one of the things I realized very quickly was you can't map a process unless you know how the process works without software or without systems. You actually have to be able to write down what the system does. And I think with APIs, it's the same thing. You need to know what you're trying to do with the API to be able to know whether you're doing the right thing or whether you've done something fundamentally wrong. And I think too many times we've kind of jumped into, we've got to have an API for that without thinking about, well, isn't the API the right pattern? Is that the way to do it? And it probably is, but what do you actually fundamentally want the API to do? And going back to where we sort of started with APIs as products, do you actually mean your API is your product? Because your product is probably still water.
Yeah.
The API is just the filtration and the pipes. It's not the actual water that comes out of the tap, and you charge for the water. So the fact that it's more efficient for you to use APIs to do that now, you have to bake into the cost of your water, not of your not try and sell the pipes. Don't sell the pipes.
I like like this idea of the power tools. Like, so we have, if you go into a kitchen, there's plenty of tools that are all using the same electricity. So every tool has electricity inside of it, be it in form of a battery, which is more of a product, or be it as a power plug that you can just plug in and you take advantage of the utility to drive it. But that doesn't mean that your business is in the business of selling electricity. Like there's a few organizations that are in that business, but most of them are not. We are over time. You're still okay?
I'm still okay for a few minutes. I was just checking my diary. I'm okay till 10. I put a buffer in, so it's okay. But no, absolutely. And I think the rush to how do I make money off my API was a kind of knee-jerk reaction by a lot of business types of, well, I've spent money on this. What's it going to make for me? Rather than, if you don't spend money on that, what will happen is you will stop making any money because no one will be able to consume your service.
Yeah.
But don't think it's the way. Don't try and monetize that any more than you would monetize if you're making cars. it was like, well, we'll skip the wheels because I don't do wheels. I do I do cars. It's like the system is the system, and you have to sell the final deliverable product, not the bits.
And it's this looking for what is the value of each of your APIs and what's the business model for each of them, and how. I was going
to say, if there is a business model, sometimes it's just a pipe and it's the electricity into the house. There may be a better way of generating the electricity or delivering it, but at the end of the day, as you said, your air fryer or your tea kettle or your coffee maker don't care. Yeah. It's all the same stuff. The fact that it's coming from solar, wind, or nuclear or coal, you don't particularly care. You should in the case of coal, but that's a separate issue. I think that's the fundamental mistake that the industry have been making for a while, which is do we try and monetize that bit because we had to put the infrastructure in to do it? We like saying, oh, we'll charge you differently for solar power because we've had to put in solar panels. And I guess kind of some electricity companies are trying to do that. But I think the reality is people don't want to get into different tariffs for different electricity they consume in different ways, particularly when they have almost no control over what comes into their house.
Basically, this is a really interesting thing that I've been thinking about in light of widely mapping, and it was really we talked earlier about it, and it's kind of like a decommoditization that's happening. Like when regular people are putting solar panels on their roof, it's basically they're putting electricity generators, like we're going from electricity as a utility back to electricity as a product, which is kind of weird. I don't know. I think I can't imagine. Well, now we have seen this also in other industries. Like we have decommoditization, or interesting. Like you have the fast-moving consumer goods, or things like Starbucks coffee, where you take what is really a commodity, like just very generic beans, and then you just add a bunch of different kind of flavors on top to create like different experiences. But it is taking the concept of having a coffee and turning it into like something fancier. But I'm not sure if that's the same with electricity and solar panels. So there's interesting stories here about how do these interface or how do these regimes of standardization, how are they evolving, aggregating, splitting up, and I think that's kind of like the threads through the conversation. And
I think it was something we talked about in our when we were prepping that we bring into this. I think a lot back to the kind of original .com boom in 1990, 2000, where you had supermarket.com, and they were basically a virtual supermarket that was buying a fleet of delivery trucks and building warehouses to deliver food to people to replace supermarkets. It turned out that people didn't particularly want supermarkets replaced. There is a convenience to having food delivered, but it turns out it's not the only thing people use supermarkets for. And it's really inconvenient if you forget something and then you have to, if you've got milk and you want milk, you have to go and get milk. So there's still the physical stores still had value. And I find it very interesting, and we're at the forefront of everything Amazon does here in Seattle. Amazon have opened supermarkets.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, Amazon have physically opened supermarkets because they found that people actually did, if they forgot the milk or they forgot the bread or the bananas, they actually wanted to go into a supermarket and just get it. Because if you want it, it's faster for you to just go to a shop and buy it than it is even here where we can get stuff delivered in 3 or 4 hours if you pay for it. Nobody wants to pay $20 for a loaf of bread when you can just go to the supermarket and buy it. So there are ways of doing business which I think we've forgotten, and people keep coming up trying to reinvent, but fundamentally there's reasons why, thousands of years we've had markets and shops and ways of doing certain things, because that's the optimal way of delivering things to people. You can come up with faster ways of doing it and more convenient things at a price. And we just had a very weird period because of the pandemic and zero interest rates where there was no cost associated with convenience. And we're coming out of that now. And I think we're having to realign our expectations that actually you can't just expect to have your food delivered for free within 20 minutes of ordering it. That's not possible. That's not how it works. There is a cost of somebody going to a shop to shop for you, pick it up and bring it to your house. And that is not free. And it's not a $5 tip. It is that person has taken half an hour, 45 minutes to go and do something that would take you half an hour to 45 minutes. And if you earn $10 an hour, they should earn $10 for that. And if you want to tip them, you should tip them. I think that's a thing that is a good analogy with the API world, that a lot of people thought about APIs in this. Oh, they're very convenient, therefore they take away all of these problems.
Pesky human stuff.
Pesky human stuff. And actually, the pesky human stuff is still there. You still have to validate they work the way you expected. You still have the business risks associated with wrong or incorrect information. You still have the problems of, well, where did they get their data from? And it's a whole sequence of things that go all the way back to, at the end of the day, a fleshy bag of meat and water wants to do something, and the API is just a way of doing what they want to do. Nobody actually outside of our industry cares what an API is. I mean, I keep explaining to my wife, and she has zero interest. She knows conceptually what it does, but it's not her life and it's not her problem. She just gets really annoyed if she can't book the cinema tickets on her phone.
Yeah,
and that's the fundamental thing. You're not, you're a cinema company, and if someone wants to buy a ticket, your API has to work. You can't charge them more for using the API fundamentally, and I think that's the bit where I think we got detached from that for a little while, and now I think business, what's the phrase? It's sort of gravity reasserting itself on business fundamentals. It's
right. It's like you might even want to subsidize that API call because it's getting you revenue.
And if you're AMC, your business is selling cinema tickets. It is not running an API. But if you don't run an API, you'll sell less cinema tickets. And I think too many companies have thought, well, it's going to cost me money to put APIs together. Therefore, I want a return on that. But your return is not going out of business.
Yeah.
And I think that's partly what people have forgotten. And it may increase your business because then you could sell through more places, but you shouldn't charge for that. You can't necessarily charge for that convenience fee for your APIs because it's not the same as sending somebody to a supermarket for you. It is your cost of doing business is having that Kong gateway or the Apigee gateway or whatever you have as your gateway infrastructure, your developer portal, your monitoring. All of those pieces are your cost of getting access to all these extra customers. And you can't just pass the cost. You might not be able to pass the cost on to them. But if you don't do it, you might not get those customers at all.
Yeah, and little by little, you become irrelevant because the world is digitalizing. And thank you very much, David. This was an awesome run. That was a lot of good topics, and I several things to carry away and to think a bit further on. Thank you very much for coming on to the podcast.
No, it's a great conversation. Thank you, Christoph, for inviting me.
Is there something you want to pitch as a final thing?
I think I've slipped into the conversation, but APIContext is here to deal with some of those business, that interface of technology and business. And I think we see that as being we've talked about it with the Chief Information Officer and compliance risk, and APIContext is here to provide you with a way of managing the supply chain, managing the performance, managing the data risk and the compliance risk all in one product that talks to your APM tools, provides output into different graphing packages, but fundamentally allows you to instrument and monitor what your APIs should be doing and validate that they are, whether it's for your internal audiences or for a regulator. And that's what we do. Mm-hmm. We're surprisingly good value for money is all I will say. So please try us out. Excellent. Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, David.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com, and thank you for listening.